She was 18 years old when she found a key sewn into a dead man's coat, and the door it opened hadn't been touched in 10 years. What was behind it would destroy everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and the lie she'd been living since she was 8 years old. My name is Nora Ashfield, and for a decade I believed the same story everyone else did, that my father died in a construction accident, that I was just another kid the system had to catch, that the box of old clothes and paperback books they handed me on my 18th birthday was all that was left of him. But there was something in that box they didn't know about, something he'd hidden so carefully that it took me 10 years to find it. A brass key tarnished and heavy stitched into the lining of his winter coat. Attached to it was a tag with an address I'd never seen and a word I couldn't even pronounce. Horologist. A watchmaker. My father was a carpenter. He smelled like sawdust and black coffee. He read me poetry before bed and built me a bookshelf with his bare hands. He was not a watchmaker. He couldn't have been. But that key fit a lock, and behind that lock was a shop that had been sealed shut since the day he died. And inside that shop was a letter that started with 6 words I will never forget. Almost everything you've been told is a lie. If you've ever had the ground ripped out from under you, stay with me. This is the story of how I lost my father twice and found him in a place that wasn't supposed to exist. She was 18 years old when she found a key sewn into a dead man's coat, and the door it opened hadn't been touched in 10 years. What was behind it would destroy everything she thought she knew about her father, her family, and the lie she'd been living since she was 8 years old. My name is Nora Ashfield, and for a decade I believed the same story everyone else did. That my father died in a construction accident, that I was just another kid the system had to catch, that the box of old clothes and paperback books they handed me on my 18th birthday was all that was left of him. But there was something in that box they didn't know about, something he'd hidden so carefully that it took me 10 years to find it. A brass key tarnished and heavy stitched into the lining of his winter coat. Attached to it was a tag with an address I'd never seen and a word I couldn't even pronounce. Horologist. A watchmaker. My father was a carpenter. He smelled like sawdust and black coffee. He read me poetry before bed and built me a bookshelf with his bare hands. He was not a watchmaker. He couldn't have been. But that key fit a lock, and behind that lock was a shop that had been sealed shut since the day he died. And inside that shop was a letter that started with 6 words I will never forget. Almost everything you've been told is a lie. If you've ever had the ground ripped out from under you, stay with me. This is the story of how I lost my father twice and found him in a place that wasn't supposed to exist. The box was brown corrugated cardboard, standard issue, the kind they use for evidence storage and dead men's belongings. It was sealed with a strip of yellowing packing tape that had the county seal printed on it in faded blue ink. The whole thing screamed temporary, disposable, unimportant. It held the sum total of my father's life, or at least the parts the state of Pennsylvania had bothered to collect. Mr. Pearson slid it across the table toward me. The sound was a dry, hollow scrape against the polished linoleum, and it echoed in that cavernous beige room like something final, like a coffin lid settling into place. He was a decent man, Mr. Pearson. As decent as a man can be when his entire career is spent managing the frayed ends of other people's broken lives. His tie was always slightly crooked. His coffee was always lukewarm. His eyes always carried that particular brand of tiredness that comes not from lack of sleep, but from seeing too many kids like me walk through his door and out the other side into nothing. "That's it, Nora," he said. His voice was gentle but firm. the same tone he'd used for 10 years every time he had to deliver news that was technically procedural but felt like a funeral. "You're 18 now. You've officially aged out. This is what was left in his apartment." I stared at the box. I didn't want to touch it. For 10 years, my father had been a ghost. A half-remembered scent of sawdust and strong coffee. A deep, warm laugh that I could sometimes almost hear on the edge of sleep, right in that space between waking and dreaming where the mind plays its cruelest tricks. After the accident, they told me he was gone and I was alone. The system took me in and Daniel Ashfield became a file number, a tragic backstory, a reason for the other kids in the group homes to either pity me or torment me, depending on the day. And now here he was, reduced to a cardboard box on a government table in a room that smelled like floor wax and stale air freshener. I ran a finger across the dusty top. It felt like disturbing a grave. "There wasn't much," Mr. Pearson added, filling the silence the way he always did, carefully, like a man stepping around broken glass. "A few clothes, some books. The landlord had already cleared out most of it years ago. You know how they are." I knew. I knew about landlords and their 30-day notices. I knew about storage fees and abandoned property laws. I knew about the cold, efficient lines of bureaucracy that sliced through the messy chaos of a human life and reduced it to paperwork. I'd lived inside that machinery since I was 8 years old. I was fluent in its language. I nodded. My throat was too tight to speak. "There's a small cash disbursement," he continued, pushing a plain white envelope across the table, "from his last paycheck and the liquidation of his assets." He paused on the word assets as if even he found it absurd. "It's not a lot, Nora. Enough for a deposit on a room somewhere. Maybe first and last month's rent if you find a place on the cheaper end. It's a start. A start." It felt like an ending. The final severing of the last thread connecting me to a life before foster families and group housing and the particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who are paid to care about you. I tucked the envelope into my backpack without looking at it. The zipper on the bag was broken. Had been for months. The money inside that envelope didn't feel real. None of this did. I was 18, an adult, free. But freedom felt less like an open sky and more like stepping off a cliff. Mr. Pearson stood up and the chair scraped against the floor. The sound was too loud. Everything in that room was too loud. He was signaling the end of our final official meeting. 10 years of quarterly check-ins and court-ordered reviews and awkward birthday cards signed by whatever caseworker happened to be on duty. All of it finished. Just like that. "If you need anything," he said, "you have my card. I can't officially help you anymore, but..." He stopped, swallowed. "Call me anyway." He gave me a small, sad smile. The kind people give you when they know exactly what's coming for you and they can't do a single thing to stop it. I'd seen that smile on a lot of faces over the years. Teachers, foster parents, nurses at the free clinic. It was the universal expression of decent people watching someone fall through the cracks. I managed a weak smile back. "Thanks, Mr. Pearson, for everything." He just nodded. He walked me to the door. He didn't say goodbye because men like him never do. They just stand in the doorway and watch you go, and you can feel their eyes on your back like a weight. And you know they're thinking about all the other kids they walked to that same door. And you know they go home at night and sit in their kitchens and stare at nothing for a while before their wives ask them what's wrong. And they say nothing. Because what can you say? What words cover it? The air outside was cold. Late November in Pennsylvania, the kind of damp, bone-deep chill that promises rain and delivers on the threat within the hour. The sky was the color of old concrete. The trees along the municipal building's walkway had already surrendered their leaves, and they stood against the gray like dark cracks in a wall. I stood on the steps with the box in my arms. It was heavier than I expected, not just in weight, in meaning. Every ounce of it was a question I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I clutched it to my chest and started walking. I had no destination, no plan, no address to go to. The group home had given me until the end of the week to collect my things, which amounted to a backpack and a garbage bag. After that, I was on my own, officially, permanently. The city stretched out around me in every direction, and none of it belonged to me. None of it wanted me. I just walked. The traffic noise was a dull, constant roar. People moved past me on the sidewalks with purpose, with places to be, and I felt invisible among them. A girl carrying a box, nobody's daughter, nobody's anything. I ended up at a small park. Calling it a park was generous. It was a sad little patch of grass wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing place with a few skeletal trees and a row of wooden benches that had seen better decades. The paint was peeling. Someone had carved initials into the seat of the nearest one. I sat on the driest bench I could find and placed the box beside me like a companion, like the last friend I had in the world. For a long time I just looked at it. What could possibly be inside? What fragments of a man I barely knew had some landlord in a hurry decided were worth tossing into a box instead of a dumpster? I imagined old t-shirts, a worn-out wallet with nothing in it, maybe a paperback novel with a cracked spine. The small, sad artifacts of a life lived alone, a life that ended too soon and meant too little to the world at large. My fingers were numb with cold. The drizzle had started. Fine and persistent, the kind that doesn't seem like much until you realize you're soaked through. I found the edge of the packing tape and pulled. It came away with a loud rip, a sound of finality, of opening what shouldn't be opened. I folded back the cardboard flaps. The top layer was clothes, a faded flannel shirt, the kind he used to wear every day, red and black plaid, soft from 1,000 washes. Beneath it, a pair of work jeans neatly folded. They were worn at the knees, the denim thin and pale in the places where he'd knelt on job sites, measuring and cutting and building things that would outlast him. They smelled of him. It was faint, so faint I might have been imagining it, my memory filling in what time had erased. But it was there. Sawdust, coffee, and something else, something underneath that was just him, just Daniel Ashfield. A scent with no name because it belonged to only one person in the world, and that person was gone. It hit me like a physical blow. I had to close my eyes. I pressed the flannel shirt to my face and breathed in. And the park and the rain and the cold bench all disappeared, and for 3 seconds I was 8 years old again, sitting on his lap in the kitchen of our old apartment while he read to me from a book of poems. And the light came through the window in long gold bars, and everything was safe. 3 seconds. That's all grief gives you. 3 seconds of something beautiful before it yanks the rug out and reminds you what you've lost. I put the shirt down, wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, kept going. Beneath the clothes were a few books, a dog-eared collection of poetry, the pages yellowed and wavy from humidity. I recognized it immediately. He used to read to me from this book every single night. His voice was low and steady, the kind of voice that made words feel like shelter, like you could climb inside a sentence and be safe there. I remembered one poem in particular. It was about a sailor lost at sea. He'd read it to me, and I'd had nightmares about drowning for a week straight. He'd felt so terrible about it that he let me sleep in his bed for a month, and he'd switched to reading me poems about dogs and meadows and sunlight for the rest of that winter. I traced the cover with my finger. There was a thick history of the city underneath the poetry. He had loved reading. He read the way some men pray, quietly, faithfully, every single day. Under the books was a small canvas tool roll, but when I unrolled it, the pockets were empty. The tools were gone, taken by the landlord probably, sold or thrown away. The empty slots were like missing teeth in a jaw, like the outline of something important that had been removed. And at the very bottom of the box, there was one last thing. A heavy wool coat, the kind a working man wears outdoors in winter. Dark charcoal gray, almost black. It was old and well worn, the elbows shiny with use, the collar slightly frayed. It had the substantial weight of quality of something built to last. Not fashionable, not expensive, just solid. Dependable, like him. I lifted it out and held it up. It was too big for me by a wide margin. His shoulders had been broad. I remembered that. Broad shoulders and rough hands and a laugh that started somewhere deep in his chest and worked its way up like something that couldn't be contained. I buried my face in the collar, hoping for that scent again. But the coat just smelled of dust and time. Whatever traces of him had lingered in the fabric, a decade had erased them. I was about to fold it and put it back in the box when my fingers brushed against something. Something hard, something lumpy, something that wasn't supposed to be there. It was inside the coat, in the lining, not in a pocket but sewn into the fabric itself. I could feel it through the wool, a small solid shape, a deliberate hidden weight. My heart started beating faster. I turned the coat inside out, or tried to. The lining was dark silk, threadbare in places, and there along the inner seam of the left breast the stitching was different. It was cruder than the rest, not factory work. Someone had opened this seam by hand and sewn it shut again. Someone had hidden something inside this coat. My fingers were clumsy with cold, but I found a loose thread and pulled. The seam came apart with a small tearing sound, and I reached into the gap between the wool and the lining. My fingers closed around something cold and metallic. I pulled it out and stared at it in the palm of my hand. It was a key. Not a modern key, not the flat-stamped kind that opens apartment doors and file cabinets. This was something else entirely. It was made of brass, heavy and ornate, tarnished dark with age. The head was circular, decorated with a finely engraved pattern that I couldn't quite make out through the grime. The shank was long and intricate with a complex series of wards cut into the bit. It was the kind of key you see in old photographs, in antique shops, in fairy tales. Tied to the head with a piece of faded twine was a small rectangular brass tag. The metal was grimy and dark, but I could see that something had been stamped into it. Letters, words. I rubbed the tag against the sleeve of my own jacket, my breath coming in short clouds in the cold air. The letters emerged slowly, revealed by friction, like a secret reluctantly told. The top line was a name. The bottom line was an address. Holloway and Son Horologists, 146 Crane Street. I didn't know what a horologist was. I'd never heard of Crane Street. And I had absolutely no idea why my father, a carpenter who built cabinets and bookshelves for a living, would have a key to a place with a name like that hidden inside the lining of his coat. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty as I sat on that wet bench in that sad little park, with the rain coming down around me, and the box of my dead father's belongings slowly getting damp beside me. This key was not an accident. It was not left behind by mistake. It had been placed there deliberately, sewn into the fabric by careful hands, hidden, preserved, kept safe for a reason, for someone, for me. The key was a question, and I needed to know the answer. I pulled out my phone. The screen was cracked. It had been cracked for 6 months. I typed the word into the search bar with stiff fingers. Horologist. The definition appeared in neat black text against the white screen. Horologist. Noun. A person who makes or repairs clocks and watches. A specialist in the science of measuring time. A watchmaker. My father was not a watchmaker. He was a carpenter. I was sure of that. The sawdust in his hair. The calluses on his palms from gripping tools all day. The pencil he kept behind his ear. The smell of fresh cut wood that followed him through the door every evening. These were not phantom memories. These were the foundations of everything I knew about him. So what was this? I typed the address into the map on my phone. 146 Crane Street. It appeared as a small pin on the screen far to the south. The industrial district. The old quarter. Down by the rail yards that hadn't seen a working train in 20 years. It was the kind of neighborhood that maps showed but people avoided. The kind of place where buildings went to die. I looked at the key in my hand. I looked at the pin on my phone. The distance between them was about 7 miles. The distance between the life I thought I knew and whatever waited at that address was immeasurable. The drizzle turned into a steady, miserable rain. People hurried past the park with their heads down and their collars up, moving through their lives with the kind of unconscious purpose that comes from having somewhere to be. I had nowhere to be. I had nothing but a box of dead man's clothes and a key to a place I'd never heard of. I stood up. I put the key in the zippered pocket of my jacket, the only pocket I had that actually closed. It felt heavy in there, like a stone, like a promise. I packed the box back together as best I could, pressing the damp cardboard flaps closed. I couldn't leave it behind. It was all I had left of him. I picked it up, hugged it against my chest, and walked to the nearest bus stop. The address on the brass tag was burned into my mind. 146 Crane Street. I was going to find Holloway and Son. I was going to find out what my father had hidden. The bus ride took 45 minutes. It was the slow kind, the route that crawls through every neighborhood the city doesn't put in its tourism brochures. I sat in the back with the box on my lap, watching through rain-streaked windows as the city transformed around me. The gleaming downtown core with its glass towers and artisan coffee shops gave way to older neighborhoods, row houses with iron railings, corner stores with faded awnings. Then those gave way to something else, low, slung warehouses with corrugated metal walls, brick-faced industrial buildings with windows boarded up or broken out entirely, vacant lots where weeds grew through cracked concrete in defiant green explosions. The streets grew emptier. The streetlights grew fewer and farther between, and the ones that still worked cast weak circles of orange light that seemed to make the darkness around them even deeper. This was the part of the city that progress had left behind. The old industrial spine, the rail yards and factories and machine shops that had once been the beating heart of the local economy. Now it was a graveyard. The factories were empty. The rails were rusted. The only things that moved down here were stray cats and rain. The bus wheezed to a stop at a corner marked by a single flickering street lamp. I was the only one who got off. The driver glanced at me in his mirror, a brief look that said, "You sure about this?" I wasn't sure about anything. But I stepped off the bus and into the rain anyway. I walked down the block with the box in my arms. The cardboard was getting softer now, the bottom starting to sag. My sneakers splashed through puddles that reflected the orange light in broken, wavering shapes. The buildings on either side of me were dark, their facades grim and silent. Most of them were clearly abandoned, their windows like vacant eyes staring at nothing. I checked the numbers, faded and peeling on the doorways, some of them barely legible. 140, 142, 144, and then 146. I stopped. It wasn't what I had expected, though I'm not sure what I had expected. The building was smaller than the warehouses flanking it. A narrow two-story structure made of old brick squeezed between a crumbling factory on one side and a vacant lot choked with weeds on the other. It looked almost delicate in comparison, almost domestic. The ground floor was a single storefront. One large display window faced the street, but it was so caked with grime and dust that it might as well have been a wall. No light came through it. No light came from anywhere inside. The building was dark and still the way only truly abandoned places are. Above the window, a wooden sign hung from two rusted chains. It swayed slightly in the wind, and the chains let out a faint metallic groan. I could just make out the ghost of painted letters weathered by years of sun and rain and neglect until they were barely visible against the dark wood. Holloway and Son. Horologists. Fine timepieces repaired. My breath caught. This was real. This place existed. My father had a connection to it, a connection important enough to hide a key in the lining of his coat. Was this his shop, or just a place where he worked? The name on the sign was Holloway, not Ashfield. That didn't make sense. None of this made sense. The front door was set back in a small alcove recessed a few feet from the sidewalk. The alcove offered a narrow shelter from the rain, and I stepped into it gratefully. The door itself was made of heavy dark wood, the kind that turns almost black with age. A small window in the upper half was covered with dust on both sides, revealing nothing. And below the handle there was a lock, large, old-fashioned, made of the same tarnished brass as the key in my pocket. My hands were shaking as I set the box down in the alcove, not from the cold this time, from something else, from the feeling you get when you're standing at the edge of something and you know that once you step forward you can't step back. I took the key out of my zippered pocket. It felt impossibly cold against my skin. I held it up in the dim light and looked at it. Then I looked at the lock. They were the same metal, the same age, the same design. They were made for each other. I was certain of it the way you're certain of your own heartbeat, without proof, without logic, just certainty. I took a breath. The air was thick with the smell of rain and wet concrete and rust. What was I doing breaking into an abandoned building in the worst part of the city at nightfall in the rain? Alone, with no one in the world who would notice if I disappeared. This was how horror movies started. This was how the evening news happened. But the need to know was stronger than the fear. It had always been stronger than the fear. My whole life, the not knowing had been the worst part. Not knowing why I was alone, not knowing what I had done to deserve it, not knowing if my father had thought of me in his last moments, or if he'd even had last moments at all. The not knowing was a hole in the center of everything, and this key might fill it. I pushed the key into the lock. It slid in with a smooth metallic whisper. Perfect alignment. No resistance. Like a hand fitting into a glove it had worn 1,000 times. For 1 second I hesitated. Then I turned the key. There was a loud grinding click as the old tumbler shifted. The sound traveled up the key through my fingers into my wrist, up my arm. I felt it in my chest. It was the sound of something that had been sealed for 10 years finally agreeing to open. The lock was stiff. A decade of corrosion and disuse had welded the mechanism nearly shut. But it turned. With effort, with protest, it turned. I pushed on the door. It groaned against the floor. Wood on wood, swollen with humidity, scraping in a long, reluctant cry. But it opened. An inch. Then a foot. Then wide enough for me to step through. A wave of air hit me, and it was unlike anything I had ever smelled before. It was the smell of a place where time had literally stopped. Dust, yes. Thick and ancient and undisturbed. But underneath the dust there were layers. The faint, clean sharpness of machine oil. The dry, papery warmth of old wood and aged leather. Something metallic and cold like brass left in a basement for years. And beneath all of it, so faint it might have been my imagination, the ghost of sawdust. I stepped inside and left the door open behind me, letting the gray light from the street follow me in like a timid companion. My eyes adjusted slowly. I was standing in a small shop. To my right, a long wooden counter ran along the wall, its surface invisible beneath a thick blanket of dust. Behind the counter, shelves reached from floor to ceiling, filled with small, neatly labeled boxes and glass jars. To my left, several glass display cases stood in a row like transparent coffins, their velvet-lined interiors empty, but still somehow expectant, as if they were waiting for something to be placed inside them again. At the far end of the shop, a doorway opened into a back room. Through the gloom, I could see the edge of a large workbench. On it, even from this distance, I could make out the shapes of tiny tools arranged in careful rows, and the scattered remains of disassembled clockwork. Gears, springs, brass plates. The intricate guts of machines designed to measure the one thing no one can hold. Everything was covered in a uniform layer of gray dust, a shroud. A decade's worth of silence made visible. The air was so still that my breathing created small eddies in the dust motes, sending them spiraling up into the thin light, like miniature galaxies disturbed by a passing hand. It was perfectly preserved, as if the owner had simply stood up one afternoon, set down his tools, walked out the front door, and never come back. No vandalism, no looting, no decay beyond what time and neglect will inevitably inflict. The lock had held, the walls had held, the building had waited. I ran my hand along the counter, leaving a clean streak in the grime. The wood underneath was dark and smooth, polished by decades of use. Walnut, maybe, or mahogany, something rich and warm. This counter hadn't been bought from a catalog. It had been built by hand, by someone who cared about the grain and the finish and the way light moved across the surface. This place hadn't just been a business, it had been cared for. It had been loved. I walked deeper, past the counter, past the display cases, into the back room. The workbench was large, built of thick timber, stained and scarred by years of fine work. The surface was littered with the most delicate tools I had ever seen. Tweezers with tips so fine, they looked like they could grip a single hair. Magnifying loops on adjustable stands. Screwdrivers smaller than matchsticks. Files the width of needles. Each one had its place. Each one had been used by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. I peered at the labeled drawers on the wall. The handwriting on the labels was small and precise. Mainsprings, balance wheels, escapements, jewel bearings, dial feet, the secret language of a craft I knew nothing about. And there on the workbench, amidst the organized chaos of gears and springs, a single leather-bound ledger lay open. It was thick, the pages swollen slightly with age and humidity, and it was covered in the same dust as everything else. I blew on it gently. A cloud of gray particles rose into the air and caught the light from the doorway, and I coughed into my elbow. The page beneath was filled with handwriting, my father's handwriting. I recognized it immediately, that sharp, angular script, the way the letters leaned slightly forward as if they were in a hurry. I had exactly 4 birthday cards from before the accident, and I had read them so many times that the folds had worn through. I knew his handwriting the way I knew my own face. It was a list of repairs, dates, client names, descriptions of the timepieces brought in for service, a mantel clock from 1920 with a damaged mainspring, a pocket watch from a man named Henderson, the balance wheel off-center, A grandfather clock the escapement worn estimated 3 days for the repair. The entries were precise, professional, the work of a man who knew this craft intimately. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1 week before the accident that killed him, 10 years ago almost to the day. I stood there with my hands on the edges of the ledger, and the knowledge settled into me like water seeping into dry ground, slowly, completely, changing everything it touched. My father worked here. Daniel Ashfield, the carpenter, the man with sawdust in his hair and wood shavings on his boots. He stood at this bench. He held these tools. He wrote in this ledger. He repaired watches and clocks in this hidden shop in the forgotten part of the city, and he never told me. He never told anyone. Why? I spent the next hour just moving through the space, touching things, opening drawers, trying to feel his presence in this silent, preserved place. Every object was a question. Every surface held the faint impression of a man I thought I'd known but clearly hadn't. A narrow staircase at the back of the workshop led up to the second floor. I climbed it slowly, the old steps creaking under my weight. At the top was a single room, an apartment, if you could call it that. A narrow bed against one wall, the mattress stripped bare. A small kitchenette with a 2-burner stove and a sink. A bathroom barely large enough to turn around in. A single window that looked out onto the vacant lot next door. It was as dusty and abandoned as the shop below. A thin cotton blanket was folded at the foot of the bed. A single coffee mug sat by the sink, white ceramic with a chip in the rim. A coat hook on the back of the door held nothing. It was the room of a man who didn't plan on staying, or a man who was hiding, a man who lived in the margins, sleeping above his secret, keeping one life separate from another. I stood in the center of that small, sad room, and I tried to picture him here. Coming up these stairs at the end of a long night, his hands sore from the fine work, his eyes tired from squinting through loops at gear trains smaller than a fingernail, making coffee in that cheap mug, lying on that thin mattress, thinking about me, wondering if I was safe, or maybe not thinking about me at all. Maybe this was the life he preferred, the secret one, the one without a daughter. I pushed that thought away. It was a familiar thought, a well-worn path in my mind, the path of the abandoned child, the path that says you weren't enough, you weren't worth staying for. I went back downstairs. The light was almost gone now. The shop had become a world of shadows. The shapes of the display cases and the shelves and the workbench were losing their edges, dissolving into the general darkness. I needed to go. I had nowhere to sleep tonight. This dusty, cold, ghost-filled shop was not a home. Not yet. As I was moving toward the front door, my foot caught on something behind the counter. I stumbled, caught myself on the edge of the counter, and looked down. Tucked away in the shadows, pushed against the wall where it was nearly invisible, was a small metal strongbox, the kind you might keep petty cash in. Dark green paint chipped and scratched, about the size of a shoebox. My heart rate, which had been settling back toward normal, spiked again. I pulled it out from behind the counter and set it on top. It was heavy for its size. The lid was secured with a combination lock. 3 small brass dials, each numbered 0 through 9. A combination. 3 digits. 1,000 possible combinations. I could sit here until morning and never find the right one. I tried the obvious ones first. His birthday, the month and day. Nothing. My birthday. Nothing. The year I was born, the year he died. Our old apartment number. The last 4 digits of the phone number I still remembered from childhood, the one I used to call when I was scared. Nothing. 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 I sat back on my heels and stared at the lock. The box felt important. Things hidden behind combination locks in the backs of secret shops are not trivial. Whatever was in here, my father had wanted it kept safe. And then I thought of the ledger, the last entry, the date, October 14th. It was absurd, a ridiculous movie plot idea, the kind of thing that works in fiction and never in real life. But I was sitting in a dead man's secret workshop holding a key that had been sewn into the lining of his coat, so reality and fiction had already lost their boundary lines for the evening. I knelt down and dialed in the numbers. 1014, October 14th, the last day he worked here, the last day of his life as Daniel Ashfield. I pulled on the latch. It clicked open. I stared at my own hands. They were trembling. I almost laughed. It was the kind of laugh that lives right next to crying, and I wasn't sure which way I'd go if I let it out. I lifted the lid. The box was not full of money. It was full of paper. On top was a thick stack of envelopes, at least 24 of them, bound together with a rubber band that had gone brittle and brown with age. Underneath them, alone at the bottom, was a single thick manila envelope. The manila envelope had my name on it, written in my father's hand. Nora. Just my name. Nothing else. No address, no stamp. Just those 4 letters in his sharp, forward-leaning script. As if he'd known that if this envelope ever reached its intended reader, it wouldn't need an address. Because the reader would already be here, in this shop, having found the key, having turned the lock, having come looking for the truth. I lifted the envelope out. It was heavy with the weight of pages inside. I could feel them through the paper, thick and layered. Important. This was it. I knew it with the same wordless certainty that had told me the key would fit the lock. This envelope was the reason for all of it. The hidden key, the secret shop, the double life. It all led here, to this moment, to these words that my father had written and sealed and locked away and waited for me to find. I sat down on the dusty floor of the shop. The gray light from the street was almost gone. Long shadows stretched across the floorboards, and the darkness in the corners had grown thick and deep. The clocks on the shelves were all still. Not one of them ticked. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. I opened the envelope. Inside were several pages of paper densely filled with that familiar angular handwriting. The ink was blue. The pages were slightly yellowed. The hand that had written them had pressed hard, leaving slight indentations on the back of each sheet. He had written this with force, with urgency, with the knowledge that these words might be the last communication he ever had with his daughter. I held the pages up to catch the last of the fading light, and I began to read. My dearest Nora, if you are reading this, it means I am gone. And it means that against all odds you found your way back here, to this shop, to this life I tried so hard to keep you away from. I am so sorry for everything. I need you to know that nothing that happened was your fault. You were a child. You were innocent. And almost everything you've been told about me, about us, about what happened is a lie. A lie I created to protect you. I had to stop reading. The words on the page seemed to vibrate. The air around me felt different, charged, electric, like the moment before lightning. A lie. My entire life since his death. The story of the tragic accident. The narrative of the orphaned daughter who fell through the cracks. The decade of foster homes and social workers and quiet, corrosive grief. All of it built on a lie. His lie. I forced myself to keep reading. My hands were shaking so badly that the pages rustled like dry leaves in a wind. First, you must understand about this place. This shop did not belong to a man named Holloway. It belonged to my father. Your grandfather, Edmund Ashfield. He was the horologist. He was one of the best in the state. The name on the sign, Holloway and Son, was a fiction, a cover, a way to stay hidden, because our real name, Ashfield, had become dangerous. My grandfather, Edmund Ashfield. I'd been told he died before I was born, that he was a distant figure, unimportant, barely a footnote in the family history. Another lie. Another carefully constructed absence. The letter went on, and with every paragraph, another piece of the world I thought I knew was picked up and turned over and revealed to be something else entirely. My grandfather had been a master craftsman, one of the last true horologists in the city. People brought him timepieces from across the state. He could fix anything. Grandfather clocks, marine chronometers, pocket watches from the 19th century with complications so intricate they would take a modern engineer months to understand. He had magic in his hands. That's what they said about him. Magic. But Edmund Ashfield had a weakness. Not drink, not gambling, something worse, trust. He trusted the wrong person. In the late 1970s, Edmund needed money to expand the shop. He borrowed from a man named Ray Corwin. Corwin was a local businessman who had his hands in everything south of the river. Real estate, construction, lending. The kind of lending that doesn't involve banks or paperwork or anything resembling fairness. Corwin lent Edmund the money at terms that seemed generous, and then slowly, systematically changed those terms. Interest compounded on interest. Fees appeared that had never been discussed. The debt grew like a living thing feeding on itself, always hungry, never satisfied. By the time Edmund realized what had happened, it was too late. He owed Corwin more than the shop was worth, more than everything he owned combined. And Corwin didn't want his money back. Corwin wanted the shop, the building, the land it sat on. But Edmund wouldn't sell. He refused. He was stubborn that way. The shop was his life's work. His father had built before him. It was Ashfield ground, and he would die before he gave it up. So Corwin took a different approach. He took control. He told Edmund he could work to pay off the debt, but the shop was collateral. Edmund's life was collateral. The name on the sign was changed. Holloway. A fiction. Because Corwin didn't want anyone to know that an Ashfield still worked there. As far as the world was concerned, the shop belonged to Corwin. Edmund was just a tenant, a tool, a man trapped in his own life. When Edmund died, the debt passed to my father. Daniel was just a teenager. He didn't want the shop. He didn't want the debt. He didn't want any part of the dark, tangled web that Corwin had woven around his family. He was a carpenter. He was good with his hands in a different way. He wanted to build things, houses, furniture, a normal life. But the debt was there. Corwin owned it, and Corwin owned him. I was born, my father wrote, and everything changed. You were so small, Nora, so perfect. And I looked at you in that hospital, and I knew I couldn't let them own you, too. I couldn't let you grow up in that shadow. Always looking over your shoulder, always knowing that some man in a corner office controlled your family's fate. So I worked 2 lives, carpenter by day, horologist by night. Every dollar I earned in this shop went straight to Corwin's people. Every receipt, every payment I documented. I kept records of everything, because I knew that someday the paper trail would matter. And then the paragraph that broke something inside me. The accident was not an accident, Nora. I was close to paying it all off, another year, maybe less. Corwin was getting nervous. If the debt was cleared, he lost his hold on me. He lost his claim on the shop. And the shop sits on land that has become very valuable. The whole district is being eyed for redevelopment. Corwin wants this block. He wants every building on it, and he was not going to let a carpenter and his daughter stand in his way. They arranged for something to happen at the construction site. A warning, a scare, something to remind me who was in charge. But it went wrong. Or maybe it went exactly as they planned. I don't know. All I know is that I was hurt badly. And lying in that hospital bed, I realized something that I should have understood years earlier. They were never going to let me go. As long as you existed, as long as you were connected to me, you were leverage. You were the pressure point, the thing they could threaten to keep me in line. I was sobbing. There is no other word for it, not crying, sobbing. The kind that comes from the deepest part of you, the kind that shakes your whole body and leaves you gasping. The pages were getting wet. I had to hold them away from my face to keep the ink from running. The story I had carried for 10 years. The story of a father lost to a random tragic accident. The narrative of meaningless loss that I had built my entire identity around. It was being taken apart, word by word, sentence by sentence, and what was being revealed underneath was so much bigger and so much more terrible than I had ever imagined. He hadn't just died. He had been destroyed, deliberately, by a man who wanted his land, and he hadn't abandoned me. He had done the opposite. So I made a choice, the letter continued. The hardest choice any father has ever had to make. I used what little money I had left to disappear. I paid someone to make it official. A death certificate, a closed case, a tragic accident, nothing more. I let the state take you, Nora, because I knew the system, for all its cruelty, for all its failures, was the one place Corwin couldn't reach you. Inside the system, you were just a number, a file. You had no connection to me, to the shop, to the debt. You were invisible to him. You were safe. I became a ghost so that you could be free. I gave you up so that I could save you. I let the pages fall into my lap. The weight of his words was physical. I could feel it pressing down on my chest, compressing my lungs, making it hard to breathe. For 10 years I had felt abandoned. I had carried a quiet, burning resentment so deep inside me that I barely acknowledged it, even to myself. A resentment toward a man who had been careless enough to get killed and leave his 8-year-old daughter alone in the world. I had mourned him, yes, but I had also been angry at him, furious at him, for dying, for leaving, for not being strong enough to stay. And the truth was so much bigger and more painful and more complicated than anything I had imagined. My father had not been careless. He had been the most careful man alive. He had dismantled his own existence piece by piece to build a wall between me and the people who would have used me as a weapon against him. He had become nothing so that I could become something. After a while, my tears subsided. They left me feeling hollowed out and raw like a house after a fire. The structure still standing, but everything soft and warm inside burned away. The shop was fully dark now. I sat in the blackness, surrounded by the ghosts of clocks that no longer kept time, and I let the silence hold me. It wasn't a comfortable silence. It was the silence of a place that held too many secrets. But I wasn't finished. In the strong box underneath my father's letter were the other envelopes. The thick stack held together by the brittle rubber band. I picked them up. The band crumbled at my touch, falling away in brown fragments. I opened the first envelope with numb fingers. Inside was a document on heavy legal paper. A deed. The deed to the building at 146 Crane Street. It was in my grandfather's name. Edmund Ashfield. Dated 1962. It was real. The building belonged to my family. It had always belonged to my family. The second envelope contained a thick stack of receipts, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, Payment records, each one meticulously dated and noted in my father's handwriting. Payments made to a holding company called Corwin Properties, LLC. Every single dollar he had earned in this shop documented. A paper trail stretching back nearly 2 decades. Proof that the debt had been serviced. Proof of the arrangement. Proof of everything. My father had been building a weapon, one receipt at a time. And the last envelope. The last one was different from the others. It was newer. The paper was whiter, the printing sharper. Inside was a series of letters on expensive letterhead. Corwin Capital Group. They were addressed to the estate of Edmund Ashfield. They were offers to buy the property. The first, dated 5 years ago, was a lowball number. Polite language, an expression of interest. The second, a year later, was higher, more insistent. The third, higher still, with language about development opportunities and neighborhood revitalization. And the most recent one, dated just 2 months ago, was different. It was a final offer. The language was cold and precise, full of legal terminology about eminent domain and municipal redevelopment initiatives and tax lien enforcement. It stated in neat black type that the property at 146 Crane Street would be subject to seizure for unpaid back taxes if the offer was not accepted within 60 days. The amount of back taxes they claimed was owed was enormous, impossible. More money than my father could have earned in a lifetime. And then I saw it. The number. It was almost exactly the same amount as the remaining balance on the original debt to Corwin. They had simply moved the number from one column to another, transformed an illegal private debt into a legal public one. They had laundered the chains that bound my family and made them look like paperwork. They were still trying to take the shop, after all these years, after everything. They were still trying to take what belonged to us. The whole picture crashed down on me at once. My father hadn't just left me a letter. He hadn't just left me the truth. He had left me a fight. He had left me the deed, the proof of ownership, the payment records, the evidence of decades of extortion. And he had left me a choice. I could take Corwin's offer. The money was more than I had ever seen. More than I could imagine. I could walk away from this dusty, sad, broken place and start a new life. A safe life, a comfortable life. I could disappear just like he did, but into comfort instead of shadows. Or I could stay. I could fight. I could use the evidence he had so carefully, so painstakingly collected over years of silent secret work to expose them, to clear his name, to save his father's shop, to finish what he started. I sat there on the cold floor with the papers spread around me, and the darkness pressing in from every side, and I felt the full weight of it. I was 18 years old. I had a broken backpack, a cracked phone, and a few $100s to my name. I had no family, no connections, no experience, no power. I was asking whether I could take on a corporation that had been swallowing people like my family for decades. The answer by any rational measure was no. It was impossible. It was insane. But there in the bottom of the strong box, underneath all the documents and receipts and threatening letters, I saw one more thing. A photograph. Old, creased, slightly faded. 2 men standing in front of this very shop. The sign behind them was new, the paint bright. The window was clean. The door was open. One of the men was older, with white hair and steady eyes and hands that looked like they could hold the whole world in place. Edmund Ashfield, my grandfather, the man I never met, the man who had built this place with his life. The other man was younger, dark hair, a wide, easy smile. He stood close to Edmund, one hand on the older man's shoulder. They looked like friends, like partners, like men who trusted each other completely. On the back of the photograph in my father's handwriting were 2 words and a date, Edmund and Ray, 1979, Ray, the same name on the letterhead. Corwin, Ray Corwin, the man who was trying to take everything from us, had once stood in front of this shop with his arm around my grandfather. They had been friends, partners, and then one of them had destroyed the other. I put the photograph in my pocket next to the key. I put the documents back in the strongbox and closed the lid. I stood up in the darkness of my grandfather's shop and I made my choice. I was staying. The phone in my pocket buzzed, a harsh modern sound in the ancient silence. I pulled it out. Unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper. The voice on the other end was smooth and polished, the kind of voice that wears expensive shoes and drinks single malt and never raises itself because it doesn't need to. A voice that had never known a moment of genuine uncertainty in its entire life. Am I speaking with Nora Ashfield? My blood went cold. Who is this? My name is Malcolm Voss. I'm a senior acquisitions manager with the Corwin Capital Group. I believe we've been corresponding with the estate of your grandfather regarding the property at 146 Crane Street. Our records indicate that you've recently turned 18, making you the sole surviving heir. Sole surviving heir. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. How did you get this number? I asked. But I already knew. Of course they knew. They were the kind of people who made it their business to know everything about everyone who stood between them and what they wanted. They had been tracking the estate, waiting for me to age out, waiting for me to become the legal owner so they could make their move. I understand this must be a great deal to process, Voss said. His tone was silk over steel, false warmth draped over cold calculation, which is exactly why I wanted to reach out personally. The Corwin Capital Group is prepared to be exceptionally generous, Miss Ashfield. The offer on the table is substantial. It could set you up for life, a fresh start, no complications. No. The way he said that last word, complications, it wasn't a description. It was a threat. A perfectly polished, legally defensible threat. He was telling me in the language of men who never get their hands dirty that he knew exactly who I was and exactly how alone I was, and exactly how easy it would be to make my life very, very difficult. I looked around the dark shop, at the workbench where my father had spent years toiling in secret, at the sign I couldn't see but knew was there hanging above the window in the rain, at the shelves full of tiny, precise things made by my grandfather's hands, at the floor where I was standing, the same boards they had both stood on in this same room, living the same fight. I thought about 10 years in the system. I thought about every foster home that didn't work out, every school I transferred to and from. Every night I lay awake in a strange bed in a strange room, wondering what I had done wrong, wondering why I wasn't enough to keep. And I thought about my father choosing to lose me so that I might survive, choosing absence over danger, choosing his own erasure over my destruction. What would he want me to do? The answer was in every receipt he'd saved, in every page of that ledger, in the key he'd sewn into his coat with his own hands. He didn't leave me this legacy so I could hand it to the very people who had consumed his life. He left it so I could fight back. Something shifted inside me. I felt it happen. A physical thing, like a gear engaging, like a mainspring winding tight. The fear was still there. It would always be there. But now it had company. A hot, bright, fierce thing that I recognized as anger. Real anger. Not the quiet resentment I'd carried for years, but something alive and burning and ready. They had taken my father. They had taken my childhood. They had taken 10 years of my life and filled them with loneliness and loss. They were not going to take this shop. They were not going to take my grandfather's legacy. They were not going to win. When I spoke, my voice didn't sound like my own. It was clearer, steadier, harder. The voice of someone who had just found the ground beneath her feet for the first time in a decade. The property is not for sale. Silence on the other end. I could almost hear the polished smile crack. Miss Ashfield. The warmth was gone from his voice now. What remained was flat and cold and sharp like the edge of a blade. I don't think you understand the situation. There are significant tax liens on that building. The city is scheduled to initiate seizure proceedings. Our offer is the only way you'll see a cent from that property. This is a one-time opportunity. I strongly suggest you think very carefully.
I have thought carefully, I said. I'm not selling. This shop belonged to my family, and it's going to stay that way.
He laughed. A short, ugly sound. The laugh of a man who is not used to hearing the word no from someone he considers beneath him. You're a child, he said. You have no idea what you're getting into. We own this block, Miss Ashfield. We will own that building. You can either walk away with a fortune or walk away with nothing. Your choice. I've made my choice, I said, and I hung up. My hand was shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. The sound of the call ending echoed in the empty shop like the closing of a door. I had just declared war against a company with lawyers and money and connections and decades of experience crushing people exactly like me. I had nothing, no resources, no allies, no experience, no plan. But I had the deed. I had the records. I had the truth. And for the first time in 10 years, I had something else.
I had a reason to stay.
I picked up the strongbox with my father's evidence inside and carried it upstairs to the small apartment above the shop. I found old blankets in a narrow closet, wool and mothball scented, and I spread them on the floor next to the bed. I couldn't bring myself to sleep on the mattress. Not yet. It was still his. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the old building, every distant siren, every gust of wind against the windows made me flinch. I kept hearing Malcolm Voss's voice in the dark. We own this block. I kept seeing the photograph of my grandfather and Ray Corwin standing side by side in the sunlight, smiling, unaware of the betrayal that was already germinating between them like a seed in dark soil.
But as the hours passed and the rain drummed steadily against the roof and the old building settled around me with its groans and sighs, another feeling began to take root. Quiet, stubborn, unshakable, determination. I had the deed. I had the records. I had the truth. It had to be enough. It had to be. I woke to gray light and silence. For a long, disoriented moment, I didn't know where I was. The ceiling above me was water-stained plaster cracked in a pattern that looked like a river delta seen from very high up. The air smelled of dust and mothballs and old wool. My back ached from the hardwood floor beneath the thin blankets, and my neck was stiff from using my backpack as a pillow. Then it came back. All of it. The box. The key. The shop. The letter. The phone call. I sat up. The small apartment was dim, the single window letting in a pale wash of morning light that illuminated the dust motes drifting in the air like snow falling in slow motion. The coffee mug still sat by the sink. The stripped mattress still sagged on its metal frame. Everything was exactly as it had been the night before, which meant everything was exactly as it had been for the past 10 years. Nothing had changed in this room since my father left it for the last time. But something had changed in me. I stood up, my joints protesting, and walked to the window. The view was the vacant lot next door, a rectangle of cracked concrete and dead weeds stretching to the brick wall of the neighboring warehouse. Beyond it, The rest of the industrial district spread out in a landscape of low rooftops and rusted fire escapes and utility poles leaning at tired angles. In the distance, the downtown skyline rose like a row of silver teeth against the gray sky. That was the other city. The one with the jobs and the coffee shops and the people who had never heard of Crane Street. The one that didn't know this place existed. I looked down at my hands. They were dirty. The grime of the shop had worked its way into every line and crease of my palms. Under my fingernails, dark crescents of decades-old dust. I flexed my fingers. They were small hands, young hands. Hands that had never fixed a clock or filed a legal motion or stood up to a man in a corner office with the power to crush me. But they were my hands. They were all I had. I splashed cold water on my face from the sink. The pipes groaned and coughed and eventually produced a rusty trickle that cleared after a few seconds. The water was icy. It shocked me fully awake in a way that felt almost violent, and I was grateful for it. I needed to be awake. I needed to be sharp. I needed to think. The money from Mr. Pearson's envelope. I pulled it out and counted it. $412. The sum total of my father's liquidated assets and his final paycheck from the construction company that no longer existed. $412 to start a life. I divided it in my head. I needed cleaning supplies. I needed food. I needed to get the water and electricity properly connected. I needed a phone charger. I needed 100 things I couldn't afford, so I would have to choose the 10 things I couldn't live without and make them last. I went downstairs. The shop looked different in the morning light, less haunted, more sad. The dust was still everywhere, a thick felt carpet on every surface. But where the weak sunlight came through the edges of the grimy front window, it caught the dust in the air and turned it into something almost beautiful. Golden motes spinning in slow, lazy spirals. The light found the brass fittings on the counter and the glass faces of the display cases and made them glow faintly, like embers remembering what it felt like to burn. I stood in the middle of the room and turned in a slow circle. I looked at every surface, every shelf, every corner. I saw the work that needed to be done. Months of work, years of it. A person with money and help could restore this place in weeks. A person with $400 and no help could either give up or start. I found a broom in a closet behind the stairs. Its bristles were stiff and matted with cobwebs, the handle dry and rough with age. I tapped it against the floor a few times to shake the worst of the debris loose, and then I started sweeping. It was a ridiculous act. Standing in a building I might lose in 30 days, sweeping a floor that hadn't been touched in a decade, fighting a legal battle I didn't even know how to begin. If anyone had been watching, they would have thought I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But the broom was in my hands and the dust was on the floor, and the alternative was sitting down and waiting for Malcolm Voss and his people to come and take everything, and I was not going to do that, so I swept. I swept for hours. I started at the front of the shop and worked my way back, pushing 10 years of accumulated silence into piles that grew enormous. The dust was thick enough to feel like fabric under the broom. As I swept, the floor emerged from underneath. Old wooden boards, scarred and stained and beautiful. Oak, I thought. Or maybe chestnut. The kind of wood they don't use anymore because the trees are gone. Each board was wide and long, fitted together with the precision that spoke of craftsmanship. My grandfather hadn't just built a shop. He'd built something meant to stand. The air became thick with displaced dust. I tied an old rag around my face to breathe and kept going. My arms burned. My back ached. Sweat ran down my sides despite the cold. I didn't care. Every square foot of floor I uncovered felt like a reclamation, like I was digging my family out of a grave. By midday, the front room was passable.
Not clean by any reasonable standard, but transformed. The shapes of things were visible now. The counter gleamed where I'd wiped it down with a damp rag, its dark wood revealing a deep, rich patina that glowed in the light. The glass display cases, once opaque with grime, were translucent again, their velvet-lined interiors visible, empty but waiting.
I ate the last granola bar from my backpack and drank water from the tap, which had finally stopped running brown. Then I turned my attention to the front window. This was the big one. The window was the face the shop showed to the world, and for a decade that face had been blind. I found a roll of paper towels under the sink and filled a bucket with water and went to work.
It took everything I had. The grime was layered, street pollution baked on by summers of sun, rain residue dried into streaks, dust from the inside fused to dust from the outside until the glass was wearing a skin of neglect 1/8 of an inch thick. I scrubbed until my arms shook. I went through the entire roll of paper towels and most of the water in the bucket. I climbed on a chair to reach the top corners. I scraped at stubborn spots with my fingernails until they were raw.
And then slowly the glass began to clear. Light came through first in patches, small circles of clarity in the general murk, like eyes opening after a long sleep. I widened them, connected them, pushed the grime outward toward the edges. More light, more clarity. The shop behind me, reflected in the clean glass, began to materialize. I could see the counter and the shelves and the far wall and the doorway to the workshop, all of it reflected in a window that was seeing the world for the first time in 10 years. When I finally stepped back, breathing hard, my hands cramping, the window was clear, not perfect. There were streaks and smudges and a scratch near the bottom that no amount of scrubbing would fix. But it was clear, and the light that poured through it was extraordinary. It flooded the shop like water rushing into a dry riverbed. Warm, golden afternoon light that found every surface and made it sing. The brass fittings blazed. The old wood glowed with amber warmth. Even the dust motes in the air became jewels spinning in the wide beams like tiny planets in a golden universe. I stood in the middle of my grandfather's shop, bathed in light for the first time in a decade, and I cried. Not from sadness, not from grief, from something I didn't have a name for. Something that felt like the opposite of loss, like finding a heartbeat in a body everyone thought was dead. A shadow fell across the doorway. I turned, startled, wiping my face quickly with the back of my hand. An old woman was standing on the sidewalk, peering in through the newly cleaned window. She was small, slightly stooped, wearing a heavy cardigan the color of oatmeal, and a knitted hat pulled down over white hair. Her face was a map of wrinkles, deep-set lines carved by decades of weather and worry, and somewhere in the distant past, laughter. Her eyes were sharp and bright, the eyes of a person whose body was wearing out but whose mind had not received the memo. She looked at the clean window. She looked at me standing inside with a bucket and a rag, and her eyes widened. "Well, I'll be," she said. Her voice was raspy with age, slightly hoarse, but there was a warmth in it that cut through the cold air like a blade through silk. "I never thought I'd see a light on in old Edmund's place again." I stepped outside, still breathing hard from the work. The cold air hit my sweating skin and raised goosebumps along my arms. "You knew him?" I asked.
"Edmund Ashfield." She gave a slow smile, the kind that takes a long time to form because it's coming from a long way down.
"Knew him, honey. He fixed my husband's watch. Clyde's pocket watch, the one his father carried in the war. The mainspring had gone, and 3 different jewelers in the city told us it was beyond repair. Edmund took one look at it and said, 'Give me a week.' He had it running in 4 days. Ran perfectly for 20 more years after that." She paused. "That was before the money people bought everything up and let it all rot, waiting for the price to be right. That's what they do." They buy and they wait and they let good things die so they can build something shiny on the bones. She looked at me more closely, squinting slightly, studying my face with the particular intensity of old people who have learned that the important information is always in the details. "You've got his eyes," she said quietly. "Edmund's eyes, dark and steady. You in Ashfield." "I am," I said. My voice was thick. "I'm his granddaughter, Nora." Her smile deepened, softened, became something tender and almost reverent. "Well, I'll be," she said again, quieter this time. "It's good to see an Ashfield back in this shop. It's been dark too long." She extended a thin-veined hand. "I'm Mrs. Harlan, Dorothy Harlan. I've lived on this street for 52 years, 3 doors down. I watched this neighborhood live and die, and I never thought I'd see it start breathing again." I shook her hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "You planning to stay?" she asked. It wasn't idle curiosity. It was the question of someone who needed to know whether to invest hope or not. "I'm staying," I said. She nodded once, a single decisive gesture of approval. Then she turned and continued her slow walk down the sidewalk, her shoes scraping against the concrete in a steady, unhurried rhythm. I watched her go, and I stood there on the sidewalk in front of 146 Crane Street, and I felt something I hadn't felt in 10 years. That I belonged somewhere. That night I didn't sleep on the floor. I washed the old blankets in the sink as best I could, wrung them out, and hung them over the stair railing to dry while I scrubbed the mattress with the last of my paper towels and the cold water from the tap. It wasn't clean, not really, but it was mine. I made the bed properly hospital corners and all the way the group home had taught me, and I slept in my father's room. And for the first time in 10 years I dreamed of him. Not of the accident, not of the empty chair at the kitchen table, not of the social worker's voice telling me he was gone. I dreamed of him standing in the shop sunlight streaming through the clean window holding a tiny golden gear in his hand. He looked up at me and smiled. Not a sad smile, not a goodbye smile, a proud one. The next few weeks were the hardest and best of my life. I spent the money carefully. Cleaning supplies, a box of garbage bags, a cheap electric kettle from the thrift store on Fifth Avenue, rice and beans and canned soup from the discount grocery, a phone charger from the dollar store, and then the big expenses. Getting the water properly connected cost $60 and a 3-hour wait at the utility office. The electricity was more. $80 for the reconnection fee. Plus a deposit I couldn't afford, but negotiated down to half by explaining my situation to a woman at the power company, who either took pity on me or was just too tired to argue. The first time the old lights in the shop flickered to life, buzzing and humming as the ancient wiring warmed up, and the tubes in the overhead fixtures struggled to remember their purpose. I stood in the center of the room and watched. The light was warm and yellow, nothing like the harsh fluorescence of the modern world. It cast soft shadows and gave the old wood a honeyed glow that made the whole space feel like the inside of a lantern. I cried again. I was doing a lot of that lately, but these tears felt different from the ones I was used to. They didn't feel like drainage, they felt like rain. During the days I cleaned and organized and explored, the shop was a library of a forgotten craft. In the workshop I found old textbooks on horology, their pages brittle but intact. Diagrams of clock movements that looked like architectural blueprints for tiny cathedrals. My grandfather's own notebooks filled with his elegant, precise handwriting, each entry a masterclass in observation and problem solving. He wrote about watches the way a doctor writes about patients.
with care, with attention, with respect for the complexity of the thing in his hands.
I started to understand the language.
Slowly. The way you learn any language, by immersion, by exposure, by accepting that confusion is the first stage of comprehension. I learned that a balance wheel is the beating heart of a mechanical watch, oscillating back and forth in a rhythm that divides time into equal measurable portions. I learned that an escapement is the mechanism that controls the release of energy from the mainspring, parceling it out in tiny, precise increments.
I learned that a hairspring is a coil of metal so fine it's nearly invisible,
and that its length and tension determine the accuracy of the entire timepiece.
I learned that a clock is not a machine, it's a philosophy,
a tiny, perfect argument that time can be held divided, understood. And in the evenings I fought the other battle.
I started with legal aid societies. The first 3 turned me down before I finished explaining.
Too complex, too risky, the opponent too large and too well-funded. The 4th listened politely and then said they'd call me back, which is the professional way of saying no without having to watch your face when they say it. The 5th said they only handled family law. The 6th said they only handled immigration.
I called every pro bono lawyer listed in the city directory.
I called law school clinics. I called nonprofit legal organizations whose names I found on bulletin boards at the public library, where I went to charge my phone and use the internet because the shop had neither. I told my story so many times that it stopped feeling like a story and started feeling like a speech. A pitch, a sales presentation delivered by a desperate girl to an audience that kept walking away.
Most of them said no.
A few of them said maybe, which turned into no. One of them said yes, and then changed his mind after he looked up Corwin Capital Group and saw the size of what we'd be fighting. I was sitting on the floor of the shop one evening, my phone on 15%, scrolling through yet another list of legal aid organizations when I found it. A small nonprofit called the Fairground Project. Their website was plain, and their office was apparently above a laundromat in Kensington. Their mission statement was 1 sentence long. We fight predatory developers so communities don't have to.
I called the number.
A man answered on the 2nd ring. His voice was young, slightly distracted. The voice of someone who was doing 3 things at once and none of them well. Fairground Project, this is Leland.
Leland Pressfield.
He was 31 years old, a graduate of Temple Law, who had turned down a 6-figure associate position at a Center City firm to run a nonprofit out of a room with a leaking ceiling because he believed that the law should protect people, not just the people who could afford it. He was idealistic in the way that only young lawyers and fools are, which is to say, dangerously and beautifully and probably temporarily.
I told him my story.
The short version. He listened without interrupting, which was already unusual. Most of the other lawyers had cut me off within the first 2 minutes. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can you scan those documents and email them to me?"
I went to the library the next morning.
I scanned every page. The deed, the payment receipts, the letters from Corwin Capital, my father's letter. I sent them all to Leland Pressfield at an email address that ended in gmail.com because apparently the Fairground Project couldn't afford its own domain. He called me back within the hour.
This is incredible.
There was a note of excitement in his voice that I hadn't heard from anyone in my entire experience with the legal system. The paper trail your father left Nora, it's extraordinary. This isn't just a dispute about back taxes. This is racketeering. This is extortion. This is a pattern of predatory lending and coerced control that stretches back decades. Do you understand what you have here?
For the first time in weeks, I felt something other than grim determination.
I felt hope, fragile and tentative like a candle flame in a room full of open windows, but real. "I have a case," I asked. "You have more than a case. You have a story, and stories win cases."
Leland became my lawyer,
Pro bono. He couldn't afford to take a fee, and I couldn't afford to pay one, so it worked out perfectly in the way that poverty sometimes does. He explained the road ahead with the honesty that I would come to learn was his defining characteristic. It would be long. It would be difficult. Corwin Capital would fight dirty. They would bury us in motions and delays and procedural challenges. They had a legal team that billed more per hour than Leland made in a week.
but he believed we could win.
The first legal letter from Leland to Corwin Capital felt like the first shot in a war. Formal, precise, declaring that the property at 146 Crane Street was the legal property of the Ashfield family, that the tax liens were based on fraudulent debt conversion, and that any attempt to seize the property would be met with a full legal challenge, including counterclaims for fraud, extortion, and racketeering. Their response came 3 days later. A thick envelope on expensive paper filled with dense legal language that essentially said, "We deny everything and you're wasting your time." But something had shifted. The phone calls from Malcolm Voss stopped. The immediate pressure was gone. We had pushed them back even if only an inch. While the legal war rumbled in the background, I turned back to the shop. It wasn't enough to save it. I had to make it live again.
Mrs. Harlan started coming by every morning. She brought coffee in a thermos, the old-fashioned kind with the glass liner, and she sat on the stool behind the counter while I worked. She told me stories about my grandfather, about the neighborhood as it used to be, about the block parties in summer and the way the street smelled when the bakery 3 doors down was still open. She told me about the other shopkeepers who had sold out to Corwin over the years one by one,
like dominoes falling in slow motion. The hardware store, the tailor, the cobbler. One by one the lights went out and the buildings went dark and the developers waited.
"Your grandfather was the last holdout," she said, stirring her coffee with a thin plastic spoon.
Even after they changed the name on the sign, even after they took everything from him, he wouldn't leave. He died right here in this shop. Did you know that right there at that workbench? His hands were still holding a pocket watch when they found him, still trying to fix one more thing.
I hadn't known that.
My father's letter hadn't mentioned how Edmund died, only that he did, and that the debt passed down like a curse. He was stubborn, Mrs. Harlan said. Stubbornest man I ever met. And I was married to a Marine for 43 years, so that's saying something. She paused, looked at me with those sharp, bright eyes. You've got his stubborn too. I can see it. It's in the jaw. I used the last of my money to buy a new sign. I found a retired sign painter named Otis, who worked out of his garage and charged me $50, which was a quarter of his normal rate and still more than I could afford. But I told him what it was for, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said 50, and don't argue. He painted it on a piece of reclaimed wood that I'd found in the vacant lot next door. The letters were clean and sharp, painted in a deep gold against dark green. The same style as the old sign, as near as I could describe it from the faded ghost I'd been staring at for weeks. But the name was different. Ashfield and Daughter, horologists.
The day I hung that sign was one of the proudest of my life. I climbed a ladder that Mrs. Harlan's grandson brought over, and I bolted the new sign to the brackets where the old one had hung for decades. The wood was solid, the chains were new, the paint gleamed in the weak winter sunlight. I climbed down and walked across the street and turned around and looked at it. Ashfield and Daughter, horologists. It was a declaration, not just a sign, a flag planted in contested ground. We are still here. We have not been erased. One afternoon, a man walked into the shop. He was in his 70s, heavy set, wearing a canvas jacket and a wool cap. He had the careful walk of a man whose knees had given him trouble for the last decade, and the steady eyes of someone who had made peace with it. He reached into his pocket and produced a pocket watch. It was beautiful. Silver case, slightly tarnished with an engraved pattern on the cover that might have been vines or might have been waves. The chain was silver, too fine linked and delicate. My grandfather gave me this, he said. He carried it in the First World War. Hasn't run in 30 years. I heard in Ashfield was back in business. I took the watch from his outstretched hand. It was heavier than it looked. I could feel the mechanisms inside, silent and still, like a sleeping animal. I turned it over, opened at the back case with my thumbnail the way I'd seen described in my grandfather's notebooks. Inside, the movement was visible. Tiny gears and springs and jewels, all of them frozen in place. A mainspring that had lost its tension. An escapement that had seized. I didn't know how to fix it. Not yet. I had spent weeks reading my grandfather's notebooks and studying the textbooks and practicing on broken movements I'd found in the workshop drawers. I could identify most of the components. I understood the theory, but theory and practice are different countries, and I had barely crossed the border. I can try, I said. He nodded. That's all anyone can ask. He left the watch with me. I set it on the workbench under a magnifying loupe and stared at it for a long time, the way my grandfather must have stared at 1,000 watches before it. Trying to see what was wrong, trying to listen to the silence and hear what it was telling me. It was at that moment, with a dead man's watch in my hands and a dead man's tools around me, that I understood something. Saving the building was only half the fight. The other half was this. The craft, the knowledge, the ability to hold a broken thing and make it whole again. If I couldn't do that, then the sign outside was just paint on wood. It didn't mean anything. I needed a teacher. I asked Mrs. Harlan. I asked everyone who came through the door. I described what I was looking for. An old watchmaker. Someone who knew the craft the way my grandfather had known it. Someone who could teach me. Most people shook their heads. The trade was dying, they said. Had been dying for decades. Nobody fixed watches anymore. They just bought new ones. The old horologists were gone, retired, or dead, or both. But Mrs. Harlan remembered something. A name. Walt Jessner. He had worked with Edmund, she said. Learned the trade alongside him back in the 60s. They had been close, like brothers. Walt had moved away years ago after the neighborhood started to decline. Somewhere in Pennsylvania, the western part near Pittsburgh. She thought he might still be alive, but she wasn't sure. It took me 3 days of searching, library computers and white pages and phone calls to strangers who shared the last name and didn't know any Walt. Sorry. But I found him. A listing in a small town called Millvale, just north of Pittsburgh. I called the number and an old man answered with a voice like gravel and cigarette smoke. "What do you want?" he said. Not rude exactly, just a man who had reached the age where politeness was no longer worth the energy it consumed. "My name is Nora Ashfield," I said. Edmund Ashfield was my grandfather. Silence. A long one. The kind of silence that has weight and texture. The kind that tells you the person on the other end is not just thinking but remembering. Reaching back through decades to a time and a place that they had carefully boxed up and stored away. "Edmund," he said finally, just the name like a stone dropped into still water. "I found his shop," I said, "on Crane Street."
I'm trying to save it, and I need help. I'm 78 years old, he said. I haven't picked up a loop in 15 years. My hands shake. My eyes are going. I'm no good to anyone. I don't believe that, I said. Another silence, then something that might have been a laugh or might have been a cough. You sound like him, he said. Edmund. He never believed anyone who told him something was impossible either. Stubbornest man I ever knew.
I've been hearing that a lot lately.
I told him the whole story. The key, the letter, the shop, Corwin Capital, everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, the silence stretched out so long I thought he might have hung up. Then he said, I'll come down next week.
Walt Gessner arrived on a Tuesday morning. He came by bus, which struck me as both practical and slightly heartbreaking for a man his age. He was tall, or had been now slightly stooped in the way of old men whose spines have slowly surrendered to gravity. His hair was white and thin, combed straight back from a high forehead. His face was long and deeply lined, the face of a man who had spent his life concentrating on very small things. His hands, when he shook mine at the bus station, were large and knuckled and trembling slightly. He looked at the shop and didn't say anything for a long time. He stood on the sidewalk with his worn leather bag at his feet and stared at the building, at the new sign, at the clean window, at the light coming from inside. His eyes moved over every detail, and I could see them filling with something that he was working hard to keep off his face.
Edmund would have liked that sign, he said at last, his voice rougher than it had been on the phone. Ashfield and daughter. He always wanted a daughter, you know. Got your father instead. Loved him to death, but he always said the Ashfield women were the strong ones.
He stepped inside. He moved through the shop, slowly touching things, the counter, the shelves, the workbench. His fingers found the old tools the way a blind man's fingers find a familiar face. He picked up a pair of brass tweezers, held them up to the light, turned them over. These were his, he said. I'd know them anywhere. The way he filed the tips, nobody else did it like that. And then quietly, without ceremony, he sat down at the workbench and picked up the pocket watch that the old man had left for me to fix. He opened the back case. He fitted a loop to his eye. And he looked. His hands were shaking. He had not been lying about that. But when the loop went to his eye and the watch was in his fingers, something changed. The trembling didn't stop exactly. It refined. It became controlled. The way a violinist's vibrato isn't random shaking, but precise, intentional oscillation. Mainspring is gone, he said, not looking up. Escapement is seized, third wheel pivot is bent, balance staff is cracked. He paused, but the jewels are good. The plates are sound. The dial is original. This watch wants to run Nora. It just needs someone to show it how. He looked up at me. His eyes behind the loop were magnified, enormous and watery and fierce. Sit down, he said. I'm going to teach you something. That was the beginning. Not just of my education in horology, but of something larger. Walt Gessner was not a gentle teacher. He was impatient and exacting and critical in the way that only people who truly care about getting things right can be. He would watch me try to set a hairspring and then take it from my hands and do it himself, muttering that Edmund would be spinning in his grave, and then hand it back and make me do it again and again and again. Until the trembling in my own fingers wasn't fear anymore, but precision. He taught me the way Edmund had taught him. Not from books, though we used those too. From the work itself. From the feel of metal under a file. From the sound a mainspring makes when it's wound to the correct tension, a sound so subtle you feel it more than hear it. From the satisfaction of watching a second hand begin to move after hours of painstaking labor ticking away in that steady, eternal But it wasn't just watchmaking that Walt brought with him. It was the truth about my father. We were sitting in the shop one evening, the light from the overhead fixtures casting warm pools on the workbench where I was practicing the disassembly of a simple clock movement. Walt was watching, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. And then, without preamble, the way old men sometimes deliver enormous information, he said it. "Your father came to see me 5 years ago." My hands stopped. The tweezers froze over the gear train. I looked up. "What?" "Daniel. He showed up at my door in Millvale. It was January. Cold as hell. He looked older than he should have. Thinner. He had a beard and his hands were rough. Rougher than they should have been for a man who'd been dead for 5 years. The room tilted. I gripped the edge of the workbench to steady myself. He sat in my kitchen and drank 3 cups of coffee and told me what he'd done, why he'd done it. He said he couldn't stay long. He said they might still be watching, but he needed to leave something with someone he trusted. Walt reached into his leather bag. He pulled out a cloth bundle wrapped in soft chamois. He placed it on the workbench and unfolded it carefully. Inside was a pocket watch. It was beautiful. Not silver like the one I was learning to fix. Gold. Warm, buttery gold with a case that caught the light and held it. The cover was engraved with a pattern of interlocking gears and flowers, mechanical and organic, intertwined. It was the most exquisite piece of craftsmanship I had ever seen. "Edmund made this," Walt said. "It was his masterpiece, the one he was most proud of. Your father took it when he left. It was the only thing he took from the shop, and he brought it to me and asked me to keep it safe." Walt paused. His jaw tightened. He said to give it to his daughter, if she ever came looking. I reached out and touched the watch. The gold was warm under my fingers as if it had been recently held. I lifted it. It was heavy and solid and real. "He's alive," I whispered. It wasn't a question. "He was 5 years ago," Walt said carefully. "I don't know where he is now. He didn't tell me and I didn't ask. That was the deal. But he was alive, Nora. And the only thing he talked about that night for 3 hours straight was you." I held the watch against my chest and closed my eyes. My father. Alive. Somewhere out in the cold world, living under a different name, looking over his shoulder, carrying the weight of a sacrifice so enormous that it had erased him from existence. He had walked away from everything. His name, his home, his daughter. But he hadn't walked away from this watch, and he hadn't walked away from hope. He had left it with Walt, like a message in a bottle thrown into the ocean of time, trusting that somehow, someday, it would wash up on the right shore. Walt stayed for 2 weeks. He slept in the apartment upstairs on a camping cot he'd brought with him, and every morning he came down to the shop at 6:30 and put on a pot of coffee and sat at the workbench and waited for me to join him. He also brought something else. In his old leather bag, along with his own tools and the gold watch, was a bundle of papers. Photocopies, some of them blurry, some of them faded, but all of them legible. "Edmund sent these to me," he said, "years ago, before he died. He said if anything ever happened to him, someone should have a copy. I put them in a drawer and forgot about them, to be honest, until your father showed up and reminded me what they were." They were pages from the ledger. Not all of them, maybe 24 in total, but they covered the critical period, the years when the debt to Corwin was established, the original terms, the modifications, the escalating payments, and on several of them, in the margins in Edmund's precise handwriting, were notes, names, dates, details of meetings where the terms were changed without his consent, and on one page at the bottom 2 signatures, Edmund Ashfield, The same year as the photograph, the year the partnership became a trap. I gave the copies to Leland. He nearly fell out of his chair. "This is it," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "This is the corroboration we needed. With these pages in your father's payment records, we can demonstrate a continuous pattern of financial coercion stretching back over 40 years. Combined with the tax lien evidence in the deed of ownership, this is a case." A case. A real case. Not a desperate girl with a box of old papers, but a plaintiff with standing and evidence in a story that a judge would want to hear. The same week, Leland filed the expanded complaint. Corwin Capital escalated. They filed an emergency motion for property seizure, claiming that the building was a public safety hazard, structurally unsound, a danger to the surrounding community. They produced engineering reports and code violations and affidavits from inspectors I was certain had never set foot in the building. 30 days. That was the timeline. In 30 days, a judge would review the motion. If we couldn't demonstrate that the building was safe and that the tax claims were fraudulent, the city would seize it and Corwin would buy it at auction for pennies. 30 days to save everything. And then, on the 29th day, the day before the hearing, a black sedan pulled up in front of the shop. I was inside going over documents with Leland, and I looked up at the sound of the engine. A man got out. He was tall and lean, wearing a gray suit and a black overcoat. He was in his 50s with silver at his temples and the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more precise. More controlled, a face that revealed nothing it didn't choose to reveal. Malcolm Voss. I had only ever heard his voice, on the phone, in the dark, but I knew him immediately, the way you know the sound of a storm before it arrives. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at the shop, at the new sign, at the clean window, at the light inside. His expression didn't change. He buttoned his overcoat against the cold, adjusted his cuffs, and walked to the door. He didn't knock. He just stood there in the open doorway, his eyes moving over the interior with the slow, appraising gaze of a man who calculates the value of everything and the meaning of nothing. "Interesting," he said. And then, looking directly at me, his voice as smooth and cold as the day he'd called my phone. "Mr. Corwin would like to meet with you in person tomorrow morning before the hearing." "Why?" I asked. Voss almost smiled. Not quite. Just the ghost of it there and gone. "Because he wants to see the face of the girl who's been keeping him up at night." He reached into his coat and produced a card. Heavy cream stock, embossed lettering. He set it on the counter. 9 o'clock. His office. Come alone. He turned and walked back to the car without waiting for an answer. The sedan pulled away, its taillights disappearing around the corner. I looked at Leland. Leland looked at me. "You don't have to go," he said. I picked up the card. The address was downtown, a tower of glass and steel, the other city. "Yes, I do," I said. I put the card in my pocket next to the key, next to the photograph of Edmund and Ray, next to the gold watch my father had carried through his death and his resurrection and trusted to a friend across the years. Tomorrow I would walk into the heart of the machine that had consumed my family for 2 generations. And I would look the man who built it in the eye. I was terrified. But I was in Ashfield, and Ashfields don't leave. The elevator climbed 42 floors in silence. I stood alone in the polished steel box, watching the numbers change on the digital display above the doors. Each floor passed with a soft chime, a tiny bell, marking the distance between my world and theirs. The floor beneath my feet was marble. The walls were mirrored, and in every direction I could see a version of myself, reflected back in infinite regression.
A girl in a second-hand jacket and worn boots, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, her jaw set tight, her hands clenched at her sides.
She looked out of place. She looked like someone who had walked into the wrong building. She looked like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. The elevator opened onto a reception area that was designed to intimidate. I understood that immediately. Every surface, every material, every angle had been chosen to communicate a single message. Power. The floors were white marble veined with gray. The walls were paneled in something dark and expensive. The furniture was leather and chrome, low and angular, the kind of furniture that doesn't invite you to sit, but dares you to. A single enormous painting hung on the far wall, abstract, violent slashes of red and black that probably cost more than every building on Crane Street combined. A young woman behind a curved reception desk looked up at me with professionally calibrated disinterest. "I'm here to see Mr. Corwin," I said. "Nora Ashfield, 9 o'clock. Something flickered behind her composure. Recognition, maybe, or surprise that the name attached to the appointment belonged to someone who looked like me. She picked up a phone, murmured something I couldn't hear, and then gestured toward a hallway. "Last door on the right." The hallway was long and quiet. My boots made no sound on the thick carpet. The walls were lined with framed photographs of buildings, developments, towers of glass and steel and concrete rising from empty lots and demolished neighborhoods, before and after shots. The befores were always shabby, run-down human. The afters were always gleaming, modern, empty. I recognized one of the photos. It was an aerial shot of the South Side, the industrial district, my district. In the photograph, the block around Crane Street was highlighted in red, a planned development, future site of something. My grandfather's shop was somewhere in that red zone, a tiny rectangle of brick in a sea of targeted demolition. I kept walking. The last door on the right was already open. I stopped in the doorway and looked inside. The office was enormous. Floor-to-ceiling windows formed the entire far wall, and through them the city spread out in a panorama that stretched to the horizon. From up here everything looked clean, organized, controllable. You couldn't see the cracked sidewalks or the boarded windows or the weeds growing through concrete. You couldn't see the people. That was the point. A desk stood near the windows, massive and dark, bare except for a single folder and a glass of water. And behind the desk, in a high-backed leather chair, sat Raymond Corwin. He was old. That was the first thing I registered. Not old the way Mrs. Harlan was old, softened and weathered and warm. Old the way a mountain is old. Hard and permanent, and carved by forces that had made him sharper, not weaker. He was 75 according to the research Leland and I had done, but he looked like he could have been any age between 60 and death. His hair was white, cut short, precise. His face was lean and angular. The skin pulled tight over prominent cheekbones and a jaw that looked like it had been designed for clenching. His eyes were pale blue, almost gray, and they were the coldest eyes I had ever seen. He was wearing a dark suit, no tie. His hands were folded on the desk in front of him. They were large hands, the knuckles slightly swollen with age, but steady, perfectly steady, not a tremor. He watched me enter the room without standing, without speaking, without any change in expression whatsoever. He simply watched the way a predator watches something approach, calculating distance and speed and vulnerability, with a patience born of absolute confidence. I walked to the chair in front of his desk and sat down without being invited. The leather creaked under me. My heart was hammering so hard, I was certain he could hear it, but I kept my face still. I had practiced this in the mirror that morning in the small bathroom above the shop. The face of someone who is not afraid. I wore it now like armor, knowing it was thin, hoping it would hold.
For a long moment, neither of us spoke.
Then Corwin leaned forward slightly, and when he spoke, his voice was not what I expected.
It was quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a grandfather telling a bedtime story, and that made it worse. "You look like Edmund," he said. I said nothing.
The eyes, the jaw,
that particular way of sitting very still when you're terrified. He paused. A ghost of something moved across his face, not a smile, something older and more complicated. He used to do that, your grandfather, sit perfectly still when the world was falling apart around him, as if by not moving he could hold everything in place. "You knew him," I said.
"Knew him." Corwin repeated the words as if tasting them.
"I knew him better than anyone alive. We were partners, Miss Ashfield. Not just business associates. Partners. We built something together, your grandfather and I, back when this city still had a future and men like us were the ones building it." He reached for the folder on his desk and opened it. Inside were documents, old ones yellowed and creased. He turned the folder around so I could see.
"I want to show you something," he said.
"Before you go into that courtroom tomorrow with your lawyer and your story about the big bad corporation and the poor orphan girl." The document on top was a letter, handwritten. The paper was brittle with age, the ink faded to brown. But the handwriting was precise and elegant. I recognized it from the notebooks in the shop. My grandfather's handwriting. "Read it," Corwin said.
I picked it up. The letter was dated March 1979. It was addressed to Raymond Corwin, and it was unmistakably a proposal, a business proposal, written in Edmund Ashfield's hand, outlining a plan for the two of them to purchase property along the waterfront south of Crane Street. A joint investment, equal partners. The letter laid out the terms, the projected costs, the potential returns, and at the bottom, beneath a paragraph about their shared vision for the neighborhood, was Edmund's signature. "Your grandfather came to me," Corwin said, his voice measured, controlled. "Not the other way around. He had the vision, but he didn't have the capital. I had the capital. We were friends. I trusted him. I invested everything I had into that partnership, and then..." He paused. Let the silence do its work.
"Edmund pulled out, 6 months in. The market shifted and he got cold feet and he withdrew his share of the capital without telling me. Left me holding the entire investment. The properties lost value. I lost nearly everything. My house, my savings, my first marriage. All of it gone because a man I trusted decided his fear was more important than his word." He leaned back in his chair, those pale eyes fixed on me.
"The debt your father told you about, the arrangement with the shop, that wasn't extortion, Miss Ashfield. It was restitution. Edmund owed me, he knew it. He agreed to the terms because he understood that he had destroyed my life and that the least he could do was help me rebuild it. The shop was collateral, yes, but it was collateral offered freely. By a man paying back a debt he acknowledged." I stared at the letter in my hands. The handwriting was right. The signature looked right. The paper felt right, old and real and damning. My stomach dropped. "You're lying," I said, but my voice was thinner than I wanted it to be. "Am I?" Corwin said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. "Your grandfather was a good man in many ways, a brilliant craftsman, but he was also a coward, Miss Ashfield. He made promises he couldn't keep and then hid behind his workbench when the consequences came calling. Your father inherited that cowardice. He chose to run rather than face what he owed, and now you're here, the third generation of Ashfields, to sit across from me and tell me that I'm the villain." He folded his hands again.
that patient, predatory stillness. I'm offering you a way out, the same way out I've offered every Ashfield before you. Take the money, walk away, start a life. You're young, you're clearly intelligent. Don't waste your years fighting a war that your family started and can't win. I looked at the letter. I looked at the signature. I looked at the face of the man who had controlled my family's fate for nearly 50 years, and I felt the ground shift under me.
What if he was right? My father had lied to me. By his own admission in his own letter, he had constructed an elaborate deception that lasted a decade. He had faked his death. He had let me believe I was alone. He had done it for good reasons, yes, but the fact remained. He was capable of building a lie and living inside it for years. What if the lie went deeper than I knew? What if my grandfather wasn't the innocent victim my father had described? What if the story had another side?
And I was too deep inside my own version to see it. For a terrible, vertiginous moment, I didn't know what was true. The room seemed to tilt. Corwin's face blurred. I gripped the arms of the chair and tried to breathe. Then I thought of Walt. Walt, who had known Edmund for 60 years. Walt, who had sat at the workbench beside him day after day, learning the language of gears and springs and tiny, precise things. Walt, who had kept Edmund's papers for decades without being asked, simply because his friend had trusted him to. Walt, who had looked at me across that same workbench and said, "Your grandfather was the most honest man I ever met." "I'd like to take this letter with me," I said. Something shifted behind Corwin's eyes, a flicker of calculation. He hadn't expected that. He had expected tears or anger or capitulation, not a calm request. "It's a copy," he said. "Keep it." I stood up. I put the letter in my jacket pocket next to all the other things I carried. The key, the photograph, the gold watch, the accumulating weight of my family's history pressing against my heart. "I'll see you in court, Mr. Corwin," I said. I walked out, down the long hallway with its photographs of demolished neighborhoods, past the reception desk, into the elevator. I pressed the button for the lobby and watched the numbers descend 42 floors of silence, and I held myself together with everything I had. I made it to the sidewalk before my hands started shaking. I went straight to the shop. Walt was at the workbench, a loop in his eye, working on the silver pocket watch that had become our ongoing lesson. Mrs. Harlan was on her stool with her thermos. Leland was at the counter, surrounded by files. They all looked up when I came through the door. I put the letter on the workbench in front of Walt. "Corwin says Edmund came to him," I said. "He says the partnership was Edmund's idea. He says Edmund pulled out and left him with the losses. He says the debt was legitimate." Walt put down his tools. He picked up the letter. He read it slowly, his lips moving slightly the way old men sometimes read. When he finished, he set it down on the bench and stared at it for a long time. Nobody spoke. Then Walt reached across the bench and picked up a pencil. He pointed the tip at the signature at the bottom of the letter. "Look at this," he said. "Look at the E in Edmund, the way the upstroke curves, the way the crossbar on the A sits high and level, clean, confident, both hands steady." I looked. The signature was elegant, precise, the handwriting of a man with perfect fine motor control. "Now look at this." Walt reached into his bag and produced one of the photocopied ledger pages. He pointed to Edmund's signature at the bottom, dated 1981. The handwriting was different, still recognizable, still Edmund's, but the E was slightly shaky. The crossbar on the A dropped at the end. The whole signature leaned to the left, where the earlier one had been perfectly upright. In September of 1975, Walt said, his voice quiet and steady. Edmund was working on a marine chronometer. Big job, important client. The mainspring let go while he was adjusting the barrel. The recoil drove a steel pivot through the base of his right thumb and into the tendons of his index finger. I was there. I drove him to the hospital. He held up his own right hand, pointed to the web of flesh between thumb and forefinger.
The nerve damage was permanent. From that day forward, Edmund could still work, still use his hands. He was too stubborn not to, but his handwriting changed. The fine control in his dominant hand was compromised. Every signature he wrote after September 1975 shows the same characteristics: the slight tremor, the dropped crossbars, the leftward lean. He tapped the letter from Corwin, the one dated March 1979. This signature has none of those characteristics. It's clean, it's confident. It was written by a hand that had never been injured. He looked up at me. This letter is a forgery, Nora. Whoever wrote it knew Edmund's handwriting well enough to copy it, but they didn't know about the injury. They forged the signature he had before 1975, not the one he actually used in 1979.
The room was very quiet. I could hear the ticking of the clocks on the wall, the ones I had managed to get running. A small chorus of mechanical heartbeats counting out the seconds in steady, reliable rhythm. "Can you testify to this?" Leland asked from across the room. His voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the tension underneath, the excitement.
"I can," Walt said.
"I was there the day he was injured. I watched his handwriting change. I have letters from him spanning 40 years before and after. The difference is consistent and documented." Leland was already writing. "We file this tonight. Supplemental evidence. Expert testimony from a witness with 60 years of personal knowledge."
I looked at the forged letter on the bench, the careful, elegant handwriting that was almost perfect but not quite, the signature that was too clean, too steady, too confident for a man whose hand had been damaged 4 years before the date on the page. Corwin had been thorough, he had been patient. He had built his lie carefully, the way he built everything, with precision and planning, and a total absence of conscience. But he hadn't known about the injury. He hadn't known about the tremor. He hadn't accounted for the one detail that a man who truly knew Edmund Ashfield would never have missed. The truth is in the details. My grandfather had known that. It was the founding principle of his craft. The difference between a watch that works and one that doesn't is measured in fractions of a millimeter. In tolerances so small they're invisible to the naked eye. The big picture can deceive you, the broad strokes can lie, but the details never do. That night I didn't sleep, not from fear this time, from something else entirely. I sat at my grandfather's workbench with the gold watch Walt had given me, the one my father had carried through his death and resurrection, and I worked on the silver pocket watch by the light of the old overhead lamp. Walt had shown me the problem. The mainspring was gone irreparable, but in one of the hundreds of drawers that lined the workshop walls neatly labeled in Edmund's hand, I found a replacement. The right size, the right tension, the right era. I worked through the night,
slowly, carefully, the way Walt had taught me, the way my grandfather had taught him. I cleaned each component. I oiled each pivot. I set the hairspring with fingers that trembled but did not err. And just before dawn, as the first gray light began to seep through the workshop window, I wound the mainspring and held the watch to my ear. Tick, 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 steady and true. A heartbeat restored after 30 years of silence.
I set the watch on the bench
and watched the second hand sweep in its small, perfect circle, round and round, measuring time, Keeping faith, the most fundamental promise a mechanical thing can make. I will not stop. I will not falter. I will keep going. I was ready.
The courtroom was in the old municipal building on Broad Street, not the modern Justice Center downtown with its glass atrium and metal detectors, but the original courthouse built in the 1890s with high ceilings and dark wood paneling, and a judge's bench that looked like the prow of a ship. The room smelled of old varnish and paper and the accumulated weight of a century of arguments. Corwin Capital had sent a team. 4 lawyers in dark suits arranged along one side of the table like chess pieces. Behind them in the gallery sat Malcolm Voss, his legs crossed, his expression one of mild professional interest, as if he were watching a presentation that he already knew the ending to. Ray Corwin was not there. I noticed his absence the way you notice a missing tooth. He had sent his people, his machines. He couldn't be bothered to show up himself. On our side of the table, it was Leland and me, just the 2 of us. Leland in his only good suit, which was slightly too large in the shoulders and had a small stain on the left cuff that he'd tried to cover with his watch. Me in a clean shirt that Mrs. Harlan had pressed for me that morning with an iron so old it might have been manufactured before the building we were sitting in. But we were not alone. Behind us in the gallery, the benches were full.
Mrs. Harlan was there. She sat in the front row in her oatmeal cardigan and her knitted hat, her back straight, her chin lifted, her sharp eyes fixed on the opposing counsel with an expression that could have curdled milk at 50 paces. Beside her sat her grandson, the one who'd lent me the ladder, and beside him another neighbor, and another, and another.
The old man who had brought the pocket watch, the retired sign painter Otis, the woman who ran the laundromat 3 blocks down, the couple who owned the corner store that had somehow survived 20 years of Corwin's slow strangulation of the neighborhood. A dozen people, then 2 dozen. People I had met in the week since I'd cleaned that window and hung that sign. People who had stopped by the shop with stories and coffee and broken clocks. People who remembered what Crane Street used to be and who had watched helpless and angry as it was systematically dismantled around them. They filled the gallery. They sat quietly with the particular dignity of people who have been ignored for a very long time and have finally been given a room in which to be seen. Leland presented the case. He was nervous. I could see it in the way he gripped the edges of his notes and the slight catch in his voice when he began. But as he laid out the evidence piece by piece, receipt by receipt, document by document, his voice steadied. The story he told was not a legal argument. It was a history. The history of a family in a street in a neighborhood that had been systematically bled by a man who turned friendship into leverage and trust into chains. He presented my father's payment records. He presented the deed. He presented the letters from Corwin Capital demonstrating the escalating pressure to sell. He presented the analysis showing that the back taxes were a direct mathematical conversion of the original private debt dollar for dollar, a laundering of illegal obligation into legal claim. And then he called Walt Chesner to the stand. Walt walked to the front of the courtroom with his slow, deliberate gait. He sat in the witness chair and adjusted his glasses and looked at the judge with the steady, unflinching gaze of a man who had nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. He told the story of Edmund Ashfield. Not the legal version, the human one. He talked about the man he had learned his trade beside, the man who could listen to a clock and tell you what was wrong with it before he ever opened the case. The man who believed that fixing a broken timepiece was an act of faith, a declaration that the past mattered and the future was worth measuring. And then he talked about the injury, September 1975, the mainspring that let go, the steel pivot that went through Edmund's hand, the nerve damage that never healed, the handwriting that changed forever after that day. He produced the forged letter. He produced authentic samples of Edmund's handwriting from before and after the injury.
He laid them out side by side, and he explained with the patience and precision of a man who had spent his life studying very small differences exactly how and why the signature on Corwin's letter could not have been written by Edmund Ashfield's hand in March of 1979.
The courtroom was silent. The opposing lawyers were still. Malcolm Voss in the gallery had uncrossed his legs. When Walt was finished, Leland turned to me. "Your Honor," he said, "my client would like to address the court." I stood up. My legs felt unsteady, but they held. I walked to the front of the room and faced the judge and the lawyers and the gallery full of people who had come to see whether an Ashfield could still stand in this city. I didn't have notes. I didn't have a prepared statement. I had a story. And stories Leland had told me win cases. I told them about the box, the brown corrugated cardboard box that Mr. Pearson slid across a table on the day I turned 18. I told them about the key sewn into the lining of a dead man's coat, and the address that led me to a shop that hadn't seen light in 10 years. I told them about the letter from my father, about the sacrifice he made, about the double life he lived, carpenter by day, watchmaker by night, every dollar going to pay a debt that was never legitimate.
A debt that was a collar, a chain, a way for one man to own another. I told them about cleaning the shop, about the light coming through the window for the first time, about Mrs. Harlan standing on the sidewalk and saying she never thought she'd see a light in Edmund's place again, about the sign I hung, Ashfield and daughter, about the pocket watch a stranger brought in trusting me with his grandfather's memory, and about Walt Chestner, who crossed a state to teach me the craft that my family had practiced for 3 generations.
I did not cry. I wanted to. The pressure behind my eyes was enormous, a dam holding back a decade of grief and anger and loss. But I held it, because this was not about my pain, this was about the truth.
"This shop is not a property," I said. "It's not an asset. It's not a line item on a development plan. It's the place where my grandfather dedicated his life to the idea that broken things can be made whole. It's the place where my father worked in secret to free his family from a debt that should never have existed. And it's the place where I learned for the first time in my life that I come from somewhere, that I belong to something, that I am not alone." I looked at the gallery, at Mrs. Harlan, whose eyes were bright and fierce, at the neighbors sitting shoulder to shoulder, their presence a wall against everything Corwin had built. These people remember what Crane Street was. They remember what it can be again. This is their neighborhood. This is their history, and we are asking this court to protect it. I sat down. My hands were steady. My heart was not. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When she returned, the courtroom fell silent with the particular quality of silence that precedes a verdict. Not an absence of sound, but a gathering of attention so intense it becomes physical. She ruled in our favor. The emergency seizure motion was denied. The tax liens were declared invalid, the product of a fraudulent conversion of private debt into public obligation. The court ordered a full investigation into the financial relationship between Corwin Capital Group and the Municipal Tax Authority, and the deed to 146 Crane Street was affirmed as the legal property of the Ashfield family. The Ashfield family, meaning me. The sound that went through the gallery was not a cheer. It was something quieter and deeper, a collective exhalation. The sound of people who had been holding their breath for years finally letting it go. Mrs. Harlan reached across the railing and took my hand. Her grip was iron. Her eyes were wet. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. Outside the courthouse, the winter sunlight was sharp and clear. The kind of light that makes everything look defined, every edge crisp, every shadow precise. I stood on the steps with Leland beside me and the neighbors around me, and I felt the cold air on my face, and I breathed. Leland shook my hand. His eyes were red. "We did it," he said. "We did it," I said. But even as I said it, I knew that the we was bigger than the two of us. It was Walt who had crossed a state with a bag of old papers and a steady hand. It was Mrs. Harlan who had brought coffee and stories and the memory of what the street used to be. It was the old man with the pocket watch and the sign painter and every person who had walked into the shop and reminded me that this fight was not mine alone. And it was my father, somewhere, out there in the world, carrying his absence like a wound, watching from whatever distance he had put between himself and the life he'd given up. The weeks that followed were quiet, the good kind of quiet, the kind that comes after a storm when the air is clean and the ground is wet and everything feels new. The investigation into Corwin Capital moved slowly the way all institutional processes do, but it moved. Leland told me that Ray Corwin had retained a team of lawyers twice the size of the one he'd sent to court, which meant he was scared. Scared men make mistakes. Scared men with decades of buried secrets make the biggest mistakes of all. I went back to the shop. I opened every morning at 8 the way my grandfather had. I turned on the lights and unlocked the door and sat at the workbench and worked. The silver pocket watch was finished, running perfectly. I returned it to its owner, and the look on his face when he held it to his ear and heard it ticking was worth more than anything Corwin had ever offered me. More watches came in. Word spread in the quiet way that things spread in old neighborhoods. By reputation, by trust. A woman brought in a mantel clock that had been her mother's. A man brought in a wristwatch his wife had given him on their wedding day 40 years ago. Each one was a story. Each one was an act of faith. They were trusting me with their time, with their memories, with the small mechanical hearts of the objects that connected them to the people they loved. I wasn't fast, I wasn't skilled, not yet. Every repair took me 3 times longer than it would have taken my grandfather. But I was careful. I was patient, and I was learning. Every day I understood a little more. Every day my hands were a little steadier, my eyes a little sharper, my instinct for the language of tiny machines a little more fluent. Walt went back to Millvale after the trial. He said his work was done. He said the shop was in good hands. He said Edmund would be proud. And then he hugged me, which surprised us both, and he got on the bus and went home. But he called every Thursday evening at 7 o'clock sharp, and we talked about watches and weather and the slow, steady progress of a craft that had no shortcuts and no substitutes for time. It was on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the trial, that the package arrived. I found it on the doorstep of the shop when I came down in the morning. A small box wrapped in brown paper tied with twine. No return address, no postmark. It had been placed there by hand sometime during the night in the small hours when the street was empty and the darkness was thick enough to hide a man who did not want to be seen. I brought it inside, set it on the workbench, looked at it for a long time. The brown paper was plain. The twine was the ordinary kind you buy at a hardware store. There was no writing on the outside, nothing at all. Just a box small enough to hold in 2 hands, light enough that its contents could only be one thing. I untied the twine. I unwrapped the paper. Inside was a box of dark wood polished smooth with a small brass clasp. I opened the clasp. The lid swung up on silent hinges. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was the gold pocket watch. I stared at it. The same watch Walt had given me. The watch my father had carried. The watch Edmund had made his masterpiece, the finest work of his hands. I had left it in a drawer at the shop, locked and safe. Or so I thought. But this was not the same watch. Not exactly. I picked it up. The weight was right. The engravings were the same gears and flowers intertwined, but something was different. Something had changed.
I turned it over.
The back case was slightly warm, as if someone had been holding it recently. I opened it with my thumbnail the way Walt had taught me. The movement inside was running, ticking softly, steadily, a rhythm as familiar to me now as my own heartbeat.
But that was impossible.
The gold watch had not been running when Walt gave it to me. The mainspring had been wound down. The movement had been still. I had planned to service it eventually when my skills were good enough to deserve the honor of touching my grandfather's masterpiece.
Someone had serviced it.
Someone had opened this watch, cleaned the movement, replaced what needed replacing, wound the mainspring, and set it running. Someone with the skill and the knowledge and the love for the craft that only comes from a lifetime of practice. And there, tucked beneath the movement in the tiny space between the brass plate and the inner case, was a piece of paper, folded once, small enough to fit in a space designed to hold nothing.
I pulled it out with the tweezers from my grandfather's workbench. My hands were trembling.
I unfolded it. The handwriting was sharp and angular, forward-leaning, familiar as my own heartbeat. 6 words. I watched you hang the sign, and beneath them a single letter, D. I set the note down on the workbench. I set the watch beside it, and I sat there in the morning light of my grandfather's shop, surrounded by the quiet ticking of a dozen rescued clocks, and I understood.
He was alive. He was here. He had been here on this street outside this shop, close enough to see me climb the ladder and bolt the new sign to the brackets. Close enough to see the gold letters catch the sunlight. Ashfield and daughter. He had seen it. He had come back, not to the shop, not to me, but close enough to watch, close enough to know that his daughter had found the key and opened the door and read the letter and chosen to fight, close enough to take the watch he had carried through his false death and real exile and make it whole again and leave it on her doorstep like a benediction. He was out there, somewhere in the cold, bright world, living under a name I didn't know, carrying a weight I couldn't imagine, still protecting me, still watching, still loving me from whatever distance he had decided was the necessary price of my safety. I could look for him. The thought crossed my mind like a bird across a window. I could hire someone, I could search, I could try to find the man who had unmade himself to save me and bring him home. But I didn't. Because I understood now what he had been trying to teach me with every hidden key and sealed letter and midnight delivery. That love is not always presence. That sometimes the deepest sacrifice is the one that goes unseen. That the strongest walls are built not from brick or brass or legal arguments, but from the willingness to let go of the thing you want most in the world so that it can become what it's meant to be. He hadn't left me a fortune to be cashed in. He had left me a legacy to be lived. I picked up the note and carried it to the front of the shop. I opened one of the glass display cases, the first one, the one closest to the clean window where the morning light came in strongest. I placed the note inside on the velvet lining next to the gold watch. I closed the case. Then I walked to the front door and unlocked it and turned the sign from closed to open. The morning was cold and bright. The street was quiet. Mrs. Harlan would be along soon with her thermos. The old man might come back with another watch. Someone I hadn't met yet might walk through the door with a broken clock and a story and a question that only steady hands and patient work could answer. I looked up at the sign above the window, the gold letters on dark green, the words that my father had seen from whatever shadow he watched from the words that had brought him close enough to leave a gift on my doorstep. Ashfield and daughter, horologists. I was 18 years old. I had a shop that had been dark for a decade and was learning to hold light again. I had a craft that would take me a lifetime to master.
I had a street full of neighbors who remembered what this place used to be and believed it could be that again. I had a box of old papers that had won a war. I had a gold watch that ticked with the steady, faithful rhythm of a promise kept across time.
And I had a father who loved me enough to let me go, and who loved me enough to come back in the only way he could to tell me he was proud. I stepped inside. I sat down at my grandfather's workbench. I picked up my tools, and I got to work.